She was rejected by her own clan, put on auction, discarded by everyone who walked past. But there was one man who didn't calculate what she cost. He only saw what she was. "I didn't buy you, Grakna. I saved you," said the farmer who saw the value that Orc carried. The sun over Uthgara asked no permission. It fell on the courtyard stones like it meant to melt them, and the air smelled of dust, sweat, and something older. Something that recalled burnt copper and fear kept too long. People crowded around the wooden platform, hats in hand, voices low, eyes sharp. Children climbed crates to see better. Nobody seemed bothered by the heat. They were there for something else. The auction bell rang once. The line behind the rusted gate began to move. Orcs with ropes around their wrists advanced in short steps, looking at the ground or at nothing. Some had travel marks on their boots. Others had older marks on their arms. The auctioneer, a short man in a brown leather vest, shouted numbers like he was selling corn. The crowd responded with bids or silence. Arlen Hask stood at the back. He was too lean to look threatening and too quiet to be noticed. He had brown, tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much and learned not to show it. He held his hat with both hands, fingers twisted around the brim, not letting go. When Grakna stepped onto the platform, the crowd shifted. She was different from the others. She didn't have the build of the clan warriors humans sometimes saw in the northern markets, those who looked carved from green stone, with broad shoulders and a hard jaw. Grakna was large in a different way. Her body soft, her curves wide, her vivid green skin gleaming with sweat under the sun, her pointed ears tilted slightly back, her small tusks discreet, showing only when she pressed her lips together too firmly. The laughter started quickly. It wasn't open cruelty. It was the laughter of people who don't know what to do with something they don't understand. Humans laughing at the race, at the size, at what she didn't seem to be. The auctioneer even hesitated, as if unsure how to open the bidding. Grakna looked straight ahead, not at the crowd, not at the auctioneer, not at the ground, at a fixed point in the air, as if she was looking at something no one else could see. Arlen noticed that. He couldn't have said what it was. He only knew that there was something in that gaze that didn't belong with ropes on the wrists, something that stayed whole despite everything around it. The bidding started low. It stayed low. Nobody wanted an orc who didn't look like a warrior. Arlen raised his hand once. It was enough. As he walked toward the platform to pay, a strange feeling passed through him. Quick, like a chill on the back of his neck despite the heat. For just a second it seemed as though he had been there before, in that same courtyard, with that same orange light beating on those same stones. Not a memory. Something older than memory. He blinked. The feeling dissolved like smoke in wind. He filed it away without a name and kept walking. He pulled the pocket knife from his pocket and cut the rope on her wrists in one clean motion, without drama. She looked at her own wrists, then at him. Arlen said nothing. He simply turned toward the wagon and walked. She waited a beat, like someone waiting for a trick, and then followed. The auction bell rang again behind them, but Arlen was no longer listening. The strange feeling had gone, but it left a faint residue, like the echo of a bell that had already stopped ringing. The wagon rocked with the uneven rhythm of the dirt road. The wheels swallowed stones and roots, rattling the old wood, and the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, staining the sky a dark orange. Arlen drove the horses without hurry. Grakna sat beside him, hands in her lap, watching the landscape pass. For a long time, neither of them spoke. It was a heavy silence, but not a hostile one. Heavy the way things are before they have a name. It was Grakna who broke it first. "Grakna," she said, without looking at him. He understood. It wasn't a question, it was an introduction. "Arlen," he replied, with the same economy. She gave a small nod. Her ears shifted just slightly, like antennae picking up the sound of the name. Then she looked back at the road. More silence. more dust rising behind the wheels. When the ranch appeared on the horizon, dark wooden fences, a low stone house, a barn in the back. Grachner said nothing, but Arlen noticed she studied everything carefully, not with admiration, with reading. The way someone maps exits, entrances, what might break, and what will hold. He climbed down from the wagon and tied the horses. She climbed down on her own, without waiting for help. Arlen went inside, and she followed him down the hall. He stopped at the door of a small room, a wooden bed, a folded blanket, a window with slatted shutters. There was a bolt on the inside, new, shining differently from the rest of the old wood, clearly installed not long ago. "Your room," Arlen said. "The bolt is on the inside." She looked at the bolt, then at him. "I didn't buy you," he said plainly, without softening it. "I saved you. There's a difference." Grachner was quiet for a moment. Her small tusks showed as she pressed her lips together, thinking. "Why?" she asked. Low voice, rough at the edges, no accusation in it. Arlen leaned a shoulder against the hall doorframe. "I could see you'd rather show your tusks than beg." She didn't answer, but something in her face shifted. Not much, just a tension releasing, so small that anyone else would have missed it. Arlen didn't miss it. He went to the kitchen to start supper without another word. Grachner stood in the hall for a few more seconds, looking at the bolt, the window, the bed. Then she stepped into the room and closed the door. The bolt slid shut with a firm click. From the other side, Arlen heard the sound and felt a muscle in his shoulders unknot, one he hadn't known was tight. It was the first time she had a door with a bolt on the inside. The first time a human had looked at her without calculating what she was worth or what she would cost to keep, without looking at her body with discomfort, without pretending not to look. He had simply looked at her, straight on, as if she were a person. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, listening to the sounds from the kitchen. Water, fire, a pot. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a house. She didn't fall asleep quickly. She lay looking at the dark wood ceiling, thinking about things without names. Outside, the sky over Korgash turned purple, then black, and the first stars appeared above Arlen Hask's ranch, as if they had always been there, waiting. Uthgara had a general store at its center, wedged between the smithy and the treaty registry. It was a place of pale wood, smelling of pine and tobacco, with high shelves and a stone counter where the owner, a woman named Dresser, hair pinned with a bone comb, served customers with efficiency and little warmth. Arlen and Grachner arrived early in the morning, the wagon loaded with an empty crate list and a short errand: flour, lamp oil, salt, wire for the fence. Grachner stepped down from the wagon first and straightened her coat, one of the old ones Arlen had found in the storage chest, stitched leather over a cotton lining, fitted close around her wide frame. She had adjusted the buttons herself the night before. It sat well on her. Inside the store, the quiet broke the moment they walked through the door. Two women near the fabric bolts stopped mid-sentence. A man buying nails turned halfway, looked, then looked again, longer than was polite. Dresser's expression didn't change, but her hands paused over the counter for just a beat before continuing. Arlen moved to the shelves without looking at any of them. Grachner followed, reading labels. "You carry black salt?" she asked Dresser, voice even. Dresser blinked. "We do? For curing or for the table?" "Curing. I need about 3 pounds. The woman at the fabric bolts whispered something to her companion. The companion covered a smile with her hand. Dresser glanced at them once, then back at Grachner. 3 pounds, then." While Dresser measured the salt, the whispering continued. Words like "thick" and "what is he thinking" and "bless his poor farm" drifted across the store. Grachner heard every word. Her ears were built for distance tracking, not polite ignorance. She waited until Dresser placed the wrapped salt on the counter. "Your curing ratios are posted wrong on the notice board outside," Grachner said calmly. You've listed 12 parts salt to 1 part herb for boar preservation. It should be 8 to 1. At 12, the meat dries too hard to sell by the 2nd week. Dresser opened her mouth, closed it. The women near the fabric bolts went quiet. Arlen paid without comment, tucked the supply list into his coat pocket, and carried the crate to the wagon. Grackner followed, steps unhurried. On the ride back, neither of them mentioned the store. But that evening on the porch, as the sky turned the color of old rust over the plains of Korgash, Arlen spoke without looking at her. "You didn't growl," he said quietly. "Didn't show your tusks. Not once." She looked out at the flat horizon. "Would it have helped?" she asked. "No," he said. "Then there was no point." Arlen turned the brim of his hat in his hands, the same way he'd held it at the auction. He nodded once, slow, like a man filing something important away. The porch boards creaked as the night wind came in off the plains. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted in the barn. The oil lamp between them threw a low, steady light that neither of them moved to extinguish. From somewhere far beyond the tree line, too far to be a coyote, too low to be the wind, came a sound like a voice drawn through old bone. It lasted only a second. Then the plains were silent again, the way they always were, after something passed through that had no name. They sat there a while longer, saying nothing, which by then had started to feel like something. Autumn came to the Korgash plains the way it always did. Not all at once, but in pieces. First the grass lost its green, then the mornings started holding a chill that the afternoons couldn't quite shake. Then the light changed, going gold and flat and long, stretching shadows across the fields from mid-afternoon on. Grackner noticed all of it. She had always noticed things. It was a habit built from years of needing to prove her worth in small, constant ways, because the big, obvious ways, the warrior ways, had never been available to her. So she had learned to see what others walked past. A fence post sitting crooked before it fell. A water trough developing a slow leak at the seam, a section of roof where the shingles had lifted just enough to let in a season of rain if ignored long enough. One afternoon, she spotted the crack in the east fence line before Arlen did. He was coming from the barn, carrying a coil of wire over one shoulder, when she pointed to it without a word. He stopped. Looked. The post had shifted and the second rail had split clean through. If a horse leaned on it during the night, the whole section would come down. "Good catch," he said. She picked up the other end of the wire and helped him run it while he reset the post. They worked without instructions, each figuring out what the other needed before being asked. Later, while they cleaned up by the water pump, Arlen spoke. "I wasn't always here," he said, not looking up. "Was supposed to be on the border squadrons, east of Kur Pass. But a horse fell on me during the second winter, crushed something in my hip that never healed right." He paused. "Sent me back to this land instead." Grackner listened without interrupting. "Some people thought it was a shame," he continued. "Thought I was wasting out here." He shrugged once. "Maybe, but the land needed someone to work it." She didn't offer pity. He hadn't asked for any. A few evenings later, he brought out a bundle from the storage trunk at the back of the house, folded carefully, wrapped in canvas. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. "These were my sisters," he said. "She passed 4 winters back. They're good cloth. Should fit you better than what you've been wearing." Grackner unfolded the bundle slowly. A wool shirt, a dark riding coat, 2 pairs of heavy trousers with wide legs and good seams. She held the coat up. It was well made, double-stitched at the shoulders, buttons of dark horn. She didn't say thank you right away. She took the clothes to her room, tried them on, and came back out. The coat fit across the shoulders. The trousers sat right at the waist. The wool shirt stretched slightly at the chest and hips, but not uncomfortably. It was the stretch of fabric meeting a body it was made for. She stood in the kitchen doorway, coat buttoned, and looked at him. He looked back. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not grief, but the quieter cousin of it. The sister had been gone 4 winters, but the coat had waited. Good, he said simply. 2 days later, she wore the coat into Uthgara for a supply run. She walked the main street with her head level, the dark coat over her wide frame, her pointed ears straight, her tusks a quiet fact and not an apology. A few people stared. She let them. She had stopped needing their approval somewhere between the fence post and the coat's second button. The preacher came on a Wednesday. His name was Norwin, a lean man with a grey beard and a voice built for open spaces, the kind that carried over wind without needing to shout. He travelled the territory circuit twice a year, stopping at every ranch and settlement between Uthgara and the Kur Pass to perform blessings, record marriages, and collect the small donations that kept his wagon running. He sat at Arlen's kitchen table and drank his coffee and talked about the road and the weather and a few names Arlen recognized from neighbouring properties. Grakna sat at the far end of the table, hands around her mug, listening without joining. Before he left, Norwin looked between them with a knowing expression that Arlen found mildly irritating. "Quiet ones make good companions," the preacher said, nodding toward Grakna. "Especially orcs. They don't fuss." Grakna looked at her coffee. Arlen felt something tighten in his jaw, a clean, contained anger, the kind he didn't show but didn't discard either. He filed it away. There would be a better moment to speak and a better man to say it to. He stood up and walked Norwin to his wagon. He came back inside, poured himself the last of the coffee, and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dry yard. Then he went outside. Grakna was already there, standing at the fence post they'd repaired together, one hand on the rail, watching the late afternoon light move across the grass. Arlen stopped a few feet away. "I want to ask you something," he said, directly. She turned to look at him. Her expression was steady, the way it always was, not closed off, just careful. Her pointed ears turned toward him slightly. "Marry me," he said. The words sat in the air between them. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes moved across his face, reading something. "I'm not a warrior," she said finally. Her voice was low, deliberate. "My own clan sold me because I wasn't. I don't have the build they valued. I don't have what the stories say an orc woman should have." "I know what you have," Arlen said. "The humans here don't trust orcs. The treaty is 5 years old. People in Uthgara still look at me like I'm a problem waiting to be named." "They do," he agreed. He wasn't going to argue against a true thing. "And your own people will say worse things about you than they already do." "They already said them at the auction," he replied, "in front of the whole territory. Me and every orc and human who was standing in that courtyard heard the worst of it." He held her gaze. "It's already been said. It doesn't get worse from here. What matters is what I'm choosing." Grakna was quiet for a long moment. The evening wind moved across the grass in a slow wave. "Why me?" she asked. Not with doubt. With the careful precision of someone who needs the true answer, not the kind one. "Because you've been in this yard since the day I brought you here, and you've never once asked me to think less of anything in order to keep the peace," he said. "Not the neighbors, not the town, not me. You don't shrink." He paused. "I don't want someone who shrinks." Her ears stayed still. Her tusks were quiet. Then she looked back at the repaired fence post, the one they'd fixed together in the early autumn light, and after a moment she gave one slow nod. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Arlen nodded back, the same way, and they stood there a little longer in the fading light before going inside to start supper. The storm came in fast, the way storms did over the Korgish plains. Without much warning, just a sudden drop in the wind's direction and a sky that went green-grey at the edges before going fully dark. By the time Arlen saw it from the porch, it was already close, moving like something that had made up its mind. The air had a smell to it that Grakna didn't like. Not rain, something underneath the rain, ash and iron and the faint sweetness of rot. She had smelled that combination once before, during a clan ritual gone wrong when she was a child. An elder had warned her then, "When the sky smells like the inside of a curse, you make yourself useful fast, and you don't look too long at the dark." She didn't look long. She moved. They got the horses into the barn first, then the rain hit. It came sideways, hard and cold, and within minutes the yard was running with water. Arlen was moving the last of the supply crates toward the house when the lightning came, a long, branching crack that lit up the whole property and struck close enough to feel. The thunder followed immediately, and the barn caught on the eastern wall where the old dry wood met the new lightning and decided to burn. The fire moved fast. Arlen shouted for Grakna to stay back. The barn door had been forced shut by the wind, the old iron latch jamming in the wet, and inside the horses were screaming. He was working the latch when Grakna hit the door, not with a tool, with herself. Her shoulder, her full weight, the wide body that had been a source of shame for so long, it had almost become a fact. She hit the door once, and it held. She hit it again, harder, planting her feet in the mud, and on the third impact the latch gave, and the door swung outward, and the horses burst through in a pale, rushing mass. She moved into the smoke to check for the last one. Arlen went in after her. They brought the last horse out together, coughing, eyes streaming, and got clear of the structure just before the first interior beam came down with a sound like a cannon shot. The fire had the roof now. They stood in the rain, watching it go, the horses circling in the flooded yard behind them. Later, on the covered porch, Arlen brought a wet cloth and wiped the soot from her face without asking. She let him. The rain was still falling hard, drumming the roof, and the barn was a low orange glow in the dark. He worked the cloth along her jaw, her cheekbone, the ridge of one ear. "Started at the auction," he said quietly, without looking away from what he was doing. "Every time they laughed and you just stood there. Every time something was thrown at you and you didn't flinch where they could see it." He folded the cloth and turned it to a clean side. "I kept thinking, who is she? I kept thinking that." Grakna looked at his face while he talked. "And tonight you went into a burning barn," he said. "The horse was still inside," she said. "I know. That's not the point." She understood what he meant. The point was the body that everyone had called wrong, her own clan included, had walked into smoke and fire and brought out what needed to come out. The weight, the width, the softness they had said made her less. Tonight it had been the thing that broke the door. The rain came down. The fire died slowly. Arlen kept his hand near her face for a moment after he'd finished, not quite touching, then let it drop. Neither of them moved inside for a long time. They married 2 days later at dawn in the kitchen. Norin came out from Uthgara before the sun was fully up, his wagon raising dust on the empty road. He had been brief on the details when Arlen sent word. Just the date, the time, the names. Norin arrived with his record book, a stub of pencil, and no particular expression on his face. He had travelled this territory long enough to have learned that the less he said about a thing, the less trouble he caused. The kitchen was plain. No flowers, no dressed table. Grakna wore the dark riding coat, his sister's coat, over a white shirt, her hair back, her tusks showing quietly at the corners of her mouth. Arlen wore clean clothes and his good boots. They stood at opposite ends of the kitchen table while Norwin opened his book. The vows were short and direct. Neither of them looked away from the other while they said them. Norwin wrote the names, the date, the location. He signed his own name below theirs, blotted the ink, and closed the book. "Done," he said, and went outside to wait by his wagon while they settled the record fee. They rode into Uthgara together later that morning, the wagon loaded for a supply run like any other. But Uthgara was a small territory, and word moved the way wind did, ahead of anyone carrying it. The main street was quiet, but it was a loaded quiet. People found reasons to stand in doorways. Conversations paused without ending. Grakna stepped down from the wagon and straightened her coat. A man leaning against the post outside the feed store said something low and directed at her. Something about the treaty, about what happened to orcs who got ideas above the terms, about the kind of man who would let them. Arlen was around the front of the wagon before he'd finished the sentence. The punch was clean and precise, the kind that comes from a man who has measured a distance carefully. The man went back against the post hard and stayed there, blinking. Arlen adjusted his coat. "Say her name again," he said, quiet enough that only the people nearest heard. "I'll save the rest of the conversation for your front door." Uthgara went still. No one filled the silence. They completed the supply run without further incident. No one at the counter, no one on the street, found anything else to say. Dresser packed the order without comment and charged the correct price. On the road back, the wagon moved through the last of the afternoon light, and the plains of Korgash opened up wide and gold around them. For a long while, neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was a different kind now, not the careful silence of two people getting their bearings, but the settled kind, the kind that belongs to people who have already said the hard things. Grakna looked at the horizon, then at her hands on her lap. "I stayed," she said, "when you said I could leave if I wanted to early on. I stayed." "I know," Arlen said. She was quiet for a moment longer. "I stayed because this is the first place I've known, among humans or orcs, where I was never a burden. Not something to manage. Not something to be ashamed of. Not a problem or a charity." Her voice was level, but each word sat with its full weight. Just a person, just here. Arlen held the reins and didn't say anything right away. The horses walked. The road ran straight ahead. Then, after a while, "Good," he said. It was one word, but it carried everything she had needed to hear, and they both knew it. The weeks after the wedding moved the way good weeks do. Steadily, with purpose, without drama. The barn needed rebuilding. That was the first task, and it was a large one. They began by clearing what the fire had left. Charred posts, collapsed beams, ash mixed into the mud from the storm. It took 3 days just to haul the wreckage out. Then the ground needed leveling. Then the new footings needed digging before the hard frost came in and locked the earth. Only after all that could they begin to build. Arlen drew out the frame on paper, calculating the timber they'd need, the number of working days, the cost against what the autumn harvest had brought in. Grakna sat across the table with the same paper and corrected 2 of his measurements without making a point of it. And he adjusted them without making a point of that either. They ordered timber from the mill at Kur Pass. It arrived by wagon over 3 days, and the work proper began. It was hard, physical work, raising beams, racing corners, driving spikes into green wood on cold mornings. Arlen's hips slowed him on the heavy lifts, so Grakna took the weight-bearing end of things, and he took the precision end, and between them the structure rose steadily through the cool autumn days. A neighbour, a man named Kassan, who ran cattle on the property to the north, came by on the 3rd day and stood at the fence line watching for a while. Arlen nodded. Kassan nodded back. He didn't say anything about the wedding or about Grakna, who was bracing a corner post with her full weight while Arlen drove the spike. Eventually, Kassan asked if they needed an extra pair of hands, and Arlen said yes, and the 3 of them worked until dark. That was how things changed in Korgash, not with words, with presence. Not everyone came around. Some people in Uthgara kept their distance, kept their opinions, kept their careful expressions when Arlen and Grakna came for supplies. The man from the feed store post didn't come near them again, but he also didn't leave the territory, and that was fine. Nobody was asking him to love the situation. They were just asking him to keep his mouth off it. One evening, a rider came down the road from the direction of the Kur Pass. He stopped at the gate and asked if this was the Hask property. Arlen came out and confirmed it. The rider handed him a letter, sealed with the mark of the eastern border garrison, and moved on without waiting for a response. Arlen read it at the kitchen table. Grakna watched his face while he read. The letter was from a garrison officer informing Arlen that a group of displaced clan orcs had been moving through the Eastern Territory, not hostile, just moving, looking for settlement ground inside the treaty boundaries. The officer wanted to know if anyone along the route was willing to provide temporary water and grain stops. As the group included children and elderly, Arlen set the letter on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Grakna. She had gone still, the way she went still when something mattered. "How many?" she asked. He looked back at the letter. 11. 3 children. She nodded once, slow. "We have the new barn," she said. "It's dry, and we have enough grain for 2 weeks if we're careful." Arlen folded the letter. "I'll send word back in the morning." She got up and started a list. Water barrels, grain count, the number of sleeping pallets they could put together from the storage room. Her hands moved with the same focus she gave to fence posts and supply runs and everything else on this land that needed doing. He watched her for a moment, the lamp throwing her shadow tall against the kitchen wall. Then he picked up the pen and started the reply. The clan group arrived on a grey morning, 11 figures on foot moving down the road from the Kur Pass direction, dust rising slow behind them. 3 children ran ahead, small, vivid green, loud in the way children are when they have been walking too long and have finally spotted a destination. 2 elderly orcs walked at the back, leaning on carved staffs. The rest were adults of mixed age, carrying bundles and a few covered crates. Grakna stood at the gate. She had not been part of a clan group in 2 years. She had not expected the way her chest tightened when she saw the children's faces, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, familiar in the way that her own face in a water reflection was familiar. A woman near the front of the group stopped when she saw Grakna. She was older, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone who had led people through difficult things. She looked at Grakna for a long moment, then at the ranch behind her, then at Arlen, who was standing slightly back with his arms crossed and his expression open. "This is your land?" the woman asked Grakna. "Our land," Grakna said. The woman studied her once more. Whatever she was measuring, she finished measuring it. "Thank you," she said simply. They settled the group into the new barn. Fresh straw, water barrels, the grain Grakna had counted out the night before. The children found the horses within about 4 minutes and had to be redirected. One of the elderly orcs, a man with grey locks and a carved bone pendant, walked the property perimeter in the late afternoon with slow, deliberate steps. Arlen watched from the porch without interfering. In the evening, the group lit a small fire in the yard with Arlen's permission, and someone produced a drum. The sound moved out over the flat plains of Korgash, low and rhythmic, the kind of sound that carries a long way in still air. Grakna sat near the fire, but not inside it. Arlen sat beside her. At some point, the old man with the bone pendant came and sat across from her without being invited, the way elders do when they have decided that ceremony would waste the time they have left. He looked at her for a while. "You were put out," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the name of a fact. "I was," she said. "And you built something anyway." She looked at the ranch. The stone house, the new barn still smelling of cut timber, the mended fence lines running out into the dark. "We built something," she said. The elder nodded. He reached into the folds of his coat and produced a small object, a disc of dark crystal veined with green, hung on a cord of braided leather. He set it in her palm without explanation. She looked at it. "From before the clans separated," he said quietly. "Before the Kur Treaty, before any of this. My grandmother wore it at her throat. She said it finds the center of things." He paused. "You seem like someone who found theirs." He got up and went back to the fire. Grakna held the crystal in her hand. Its surface was cool at first, then slowly warm. The green veins caught the firelight and seemed to breathe. She turned it over in her fingers, and then a strange thing happened. The same thing that had happened to Arlen in the auction courtyard. That chill at the back of the neck, that sense of something older than memory. But where his had been brief and bewildering, hers settled, like a thing arriving at the place it had always been headed. She closed her hand around the crystal. Arlen had been watching her face. He didn't ask about it. He simply stayed where he was, shoulder almost touching hers, the drum continuing its steady pulse somewhere behind them. The fire settled. Above the plains of Korgash, the stars were out in full, wide and old and indifferent to treaties and auctions and all the small violences people do to one another before they learn better. Somewhere beyond the eastern hills, the territory went on, unresolved, imperfect, still learning the shape of the peace it had agreed to. There would be more riders with letters, more mornings requiring decisions, more people in Uthgara who hadn't made up their minds yet. But the ranch was here. The barn was standing, the horses were fed, and for the first time in her life when morning came, Ragnar had no reason to wonder whether she was allowed to stay.